You've received a classwork piece of paper that you will be going through to answer the following things and to be able to complete your classwork while I'm not here. So for your warm-up, you have 3 different questions. You're going to use this graph to try to answer number 1. You can just circle whatever you think is the correct answer. On the next slide, you will see the question for number 2, or you'll see at least the excerpt needed for number 2. And then for number 3, you will use neither of these things. So go through and try to answer number 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to click through slide 1 right here. Slide 2 is right here. You can go back and pause at slide 1 if you need to spend more time on that chart, and then come on to the second thing right here to answer number 2. You should have now answered both number 1 and number 2 and number 3 for the warm-up. We're going to go ahead with our today in history. You're going to write down your today in histories where you normally would write them down. So today's date is November 10th, and the year we're going to talk about is 1938. On November 10th, 1938, Germany did Kristallnacht. Germany did Kristallnacht. Period. Second sentence. This targeted the Jewish people, killing 100, destroying 7,500 businesses, and arresting 30,000 in one day. This targeted the Jewish people, killing 100, destroying 7,500 businesses, and arresting 30,000 in one day. For this today in history, let me just give you a basic overview. This was during Nazi Germany, and there's 2 big things to point out. Number 1, that Hitler had been president for 5 years already at this point. So you shouldn't think that when Hitler became president, he's just going to immediately start targeting Jewish people. That wasn't the case. Instead, he did a very slow campaign of planting different thoughts into people's heads that Jewish people were bad for Germany. They're going to implement this because a Polish Jew killed a government official from Germany. This government official had deported this Jewish person's entire family, and the Jewish person retaliated in violence. Now, when Germany did this, they told the military to do this, but the military didn't do it in military uniform. Instead, they used plain clothes, so they were dressed like normal people. And this was to try to make it look like an organic riot. And one of the reasons for why all this was done was because Hitler wanted to see what the reaction would be. How would people respond to Jewish people being targeted in Germany? And the reaction was very mild. The international community condemned him, but there was no massive retaliation from Germans, and this led to Hitler believing that he could continue to abuse Jews and there not be any big fallback. So that's your today in history. All right. One thing I just want to remind you about is that your paper is due tomorrow on November 11th. You should be using turnitin.com to submit it. You need to have no more than 800 words. If you're not signed up for turnitin.com, you can go to turnitin.com, create an account, or log into an existing account. And then you can use the class IDs that are below and then the enrollment key that's below that to sign up. You must submit the paper by 11:59 p.m. for it to be graded. If you have any questions, you should DM me on Instagram about it. On your classwork, you should see a space for excerpt 1. And what I want you to do right now is pause the video, and I want you to try to read excerpt 1 and summarize in your own words what you think excerpt 1 is saying. You should have paused the video by now to summarize it in your own words. I want to go through with you what this excerpt is saying. Now, if you look, you'll see that I've highlighted a couple of different words that kind of point out the main idea of the excerpt. So there are planters, or people who own plantations, who want to control Black people's movement. Because of this, they host something called plantation parties, which are parties that are designed on Saturday nights or holidays to be seen as kind for Black people and hopefully to gain their respect. However, the entire time that this is going on, the person who owns them, the master, is there. Now, even though these parties are being hosted for people in slavery, people that were in slavery are going to want to go to things of their own creation, their own parties. And so because of that, they're going to host counterparties away from these plantations. So imagine you get sucked back in time and you saw two competing parties going on. It may not seem like that was a form of resistance by people in slavery, but in fact it was. This shows that opposition to slavery by people in slavery was sometimes done through things that we don't necessarily think about. So we're going to go ahead and take our notes. So the title of your notes is Tensions Over Slavery. And for our notes, the first thing that I want us to go through is something that is on your sheet of paper, which says there are 3 reasons for why tensions over slavery rose so much after 1820. I want to give you those 3 reasons. We've talked about 2 of them already, but the third one is what we're going to talk about today. So the first reason that I want you to write down is the Second Great Awakening. Remember, the Second Great Awakening is going to be a time in which people are going to feel religiously called to make society better. The second thing that I want you to write down is sectionalism. This is when the North and South are becoming more different from one another, and because of that, they feel as if they should listen more to their own regional interest and not what's best for the nation. And the third reason, and this is what we're going to be talking about at the start, is moving out west. So 1 is Second Great Awakening, 2, sectionalism, 3, moving out west. So let's go ahead and take notes. You're going to take notes on your own sheet of paper. Should have titled it Tensions Over Slavery. And you can go ahead and write this down. And I'm just going to go through and give you a couple small things about each slide. This won't be as long as our normal notes, or I won't be talking quite as long as our normal notes. Now there's going to be a couple times in this PowerPoint where I'm going to tell you to go back to that classwork sheet of paper, and you should do that when I tell you to do that. So the reason why people are going to be moving out west during this time is because the soil was now bad. People had farmed it too harshly on the East Coast, and because of that, this is where Alabama fever comes in, and every single time that people are moving out west, there's new states that are being created. Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are all created within about a 10-year period. Each time, there are going to be 2 new senators created for those states. And so because of that, as slavery is moving out west, the control of the Senate is going to become more balanced between the North and the South. And that makes Northerners a little uneasy because they're going to want to maybe legislate how to end slavery, and now maybe they can't. The state that's ultimately going to bring this as an issue is Missouri. So when Missouri becomes a state, it already has slavery in it, so they can't really get rid of it. But now there's going to be 12 states that have slavery and 11 states that don't, which the Senate doesn't really want. So because of that, there's a short-term solution made where Missouri would become a slave state, but then Maine would become a free state. Now, this would balance out the Senate, but what about future states after this? Well, they say that Missouri's southern boundary is going to become the dividing line. So all states after Missouri are going to have to be slave states if they're below the southern boundary, which is called the 3630 line, and then above it would be free states. Now, there are some people who wanted to end slavery out west, but not because of like some type of humanitarian desire. And this is the Free Soil Party. So the Free Soil Party was created in 1848, and it's our least successful party ever because they don't want to end slavery for the sake of black people. They actually want to end it for white people. There were poor white people at the time who didn't have jobs or couldn't get good jobs because they're competing mainly with people in slavery. Imagine that the person you're competing with for a job has to do it and isn't getting paid for it. You're probably not going to make a lot of money. And so because of that, they created this idea that there should be no more slavery out west so that free white people can move out west and get jobs. This doesn't really satisfy anybody though. The South doesn't want any restriction on slavery, and the North is trying to end slavery because of a humanitarian desire. So after just 6 years, the Free Soil Party is going to go away. There were not a lot of slave rebellions in the United States during this time. However, the biggest one was Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner's Rebellion is going to kill about 50 people. It went on for several different plantations. Now, Nat Turner was somebody who believed that God had ordained him to end slavery. He believed this through seeing a solar eclipse at a certain time period, markings on his head. His mother told him that he was very smart and was destined for great things. And Nat Turner was an educated, enslaved person. So when he organizes this revolt, he is going to go from plantation to plantation, killing people and then bringing more and more people in slavery with him. At the max, he had about 40 people that were in slavery with him. And this scared the white community a lot. And Nat Turner is still somewhat of a controversial historical figure to talk about because obviously he's fighting for his freedom, so we should celebrate that. But of the 60 people that he or his followers killed, 40 of them were women or children below the age of 10. And so due to that, Nat Turner was very easily villainized and seen as a monster during this time period, and it actually caused for more intense restrictions on people in slavery. Laws became more tightened, and this becomes known as the Black Codes. To understand this a little bit better, we're going to go back to your classwork sheet. And what I want you to do is you're going to read documents on the next 2 slides, and I want you to try to summarize how white people felt about this, or what the impact of this rebellion was on white people, and then what the rebellion was on black people. So at document B, you're going to read this document, and then I just want you to write on your sheet of paper what you think the response was from white people in regards to this. You can pause it if you need to. I'm going to go on to document C. Document C is what happened to black people due to Turner's rebellion. I know it's kind of small to read, but read through this and then write in your own words what the response was for black people. What happened to black people due to Nat Turner's rebellion? Now that we've done that, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about Southern culture in regards to slavery. So slavery, Southern culture was divided about slavery, especially in certain things like religion. So some churches argued that slavery was okay. That was mainly Methodist and Baptist. And so because of that, those churches became more popular. However, if your church argued against it, such as Catholics or utilitarian churches, those churches aren't going to be nearly as popular in the South. Additionally, the South is going to resist change and reform movements because they felt like it was an attack on their way of life. Southerners felt like they had this old school way of living, which we're going to go through in just a second, and that anything that was trying to change it was an attack on that. So slavery was called the peculiar institution in the South during this time. It comes from John C. Calhoun. And when we're saying peculiar, we don't mean weird, we mean special. That's at least how John C. Calhoun meant it. John C. Calhoun is, again, an all-time racist and believed that slavery was basically this form of responsibility that white people had towards enslaved people, that they were like maintaining some type of special order, so that slavery wasn't bad. It was actually some form of Enlightenment thinking for non-civilized people, which Calhoun would deem as people in slavery. Now, slavery during this time period exploded after the cotton gin. It grew by about 4 times. There was 1 million people in 1800, 4 million people in slavery in 1860. And they made up about 75% of some of the areas that we're talking about. Now, 75% could easily lead to big slave rebellions, which is why there were more restrictive laws put into place. I told you guys that after the cotton gin, slavery became less free, which sounds ironic because slavery obviously isn't free to begin with. But this is due to fear of rebellions. People are going to be more cognizant about how black people move. This goes back to that quote that we read at the very beginning. Black people maybe before 1800 could move around more freely, but now they can't. Same thing with reading. Reading is going to become more restrictive. It's even going to become more restrictive after Nat Turner's rebellion. And an interesting thing is about 250,000 free black people lived in the South during this time. These were people who perhaps bought their freedom or were set free after their owner died, and they continue to live in the South. Now, this wasn't super common. Again, we're talking about 4 million people in slavery, 250,000 free black people out of slavery, but it is something that I want to reference. Now, Southern white culture basically followed something called a feudal system. This is an old way of thinking that goes back to Europe, which is basically the more land you have, the more power you have. And the Southern white culture was built off this idea of chivalry. Chivalry is respect. It's this idea of personal honor. And so white people saw themselves in the South as very honorable, and they viewed the North not in that way, thinking that the North was more just about money or greed, or impure, whereas the South was clean, honorable. And one of these ways was the defense of womanhood. So women working in the North was deemed not cool in the South, that there should be this idea of a woman's place. And this creates this overarching concept called paternalism. Now, paternalism is where basically you're the parent to other people. And white men in the South, especially rich white men in the South, felt like they had a responsibility, like a parent's responsibility, over anyone that they deemed inferior. And anyone who was inferior were white women, poor white men, and people in slavery. So basically everyone who wasn't them. And that's another thing about white culture. 75% of white people were very, very poor. They didn't own any slaves. They lived on hilly land. Hilly land's not as easy to farm. This is where the term hillbilly comes from. And Appalachian Mountain people, where you can see the Appalachian Mountains kind of on this bottom map, but where the Appalachian Mountains are, they don't like slavery. They were the only white people who really recognized this hurt poor white people. And so therefore, actually, when the Civil War breaks out, a lot of the Appalachian regions are not going to support this rebellion by the South. Last couple of things I want to talk about are the different types of abolitionists. So we've already gone through some of this, but I want to tell you kind of just how they would be viewed by both Southerners and by Northerners. So the American Colonization Society is something we've already talked about. The American Colonization Society is going to appeal to more moderate anti-slave reformers. And these people were the ones who wanted to move black people back to Africa, mainly because they wanted the whole idea of abolitionism to go away. So this is going to be for the most moderate anti-slave person. The most radical anti-slave person would be listening to William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison stated that basically all people should be freed immediately, that white people shouldn't be compensated for their slaves. That was a radical view. He burned the Constitution a couple different times, saying that the Constitution was a pro-slave document. So he was more radical than the American Colonization Society. Then you have black abolitionists. This would be like Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth. And while they're obviously focused on Indian slavery, one of the things that they did different than maybe Garrison is trying to get people out of slavery illegally, using things like the Underground Railroad and assisting in helping fugitive slaves get away from slavery. Then you had the Liberty Party. This was a political party created in the 1840s that believed slavery was only going to end politically, and so they ran unsuccessfully, but they ran for president twice, 1840, 1844, to try to end slavery through legal measures, which did not take place. And then the final thing is violent abolitionism. These are people like David Walker, who's a black guy from the North, and then John Brown, who is a white guy from the West, who were like, hey, the only way we're going to do this is through violence. And they called for taking up arms. And in John Brown's case, he actually took up arms himself. You don't need these last two slides. So that is notes.